There is some similarities, but you're dealing there with oral traditions, and it's an easy leap of mind to say, well, we've had this going on all through the centuries and through the millennia even. The problem with that is the methods of knowing then were so different. You need to compare a phenomenon, you have to use more or less the same investigative method, and our methods now, as well as of course our perceptual capabilities, are so different. For example, just take the matter of clinical study. The people that were reporting those experiences weren't being studied clinically. Now we have a tradition of when somebody's had an unusual experience or something that doesn't fit, or you want to investigate, you talk to that person in great detail, you get other witnesses, what they've seen. So we have a kind of body of investigative tradition now that can document what's going on. So from that point of view, this appears to have some distinct features. It also appears, now I'm getting more into my own kind of sense of this, that this thing is entering into our reality in a more hard-edged way. In other words,
why do some people doubt others when they experience something bad or traumatic happening to them? Here are a few reasons. Cognitive dissonance, bias and prejudgment, fear of consequences, social conditioning, and the influence of authority figures, just to name a few. Providing a safe space, listening and believing someone when they say they've been hurt or experiencing something science can't explain can be transformative for the person who's trying to wrap their mind around a traumatic experience. Alien abductions or exceptional experience consist of people living with this feeling every day, not being believed. I sat down with John Priestland, founder and chairman of uNHIdden, along with Dr. Daniel Stubbings, a clinical psychologist and part of the uNHIdden Medical Advisory Board, to dive deep into the experiencer phenomenon from a clinical perspective and how organizations like uNHIdden can create pathways for government officials and society to better understand that the human experience is not one-dimensional, but complex, but through the eyes of the experiencer. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Daniel and John, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. The conversation about experiencers, as we know, if anybody knows this podcast and is part of the UAP community and listens to this, is that experiencers have not been taken seriously to any degree by the American government or the American military. So I know that this is a conversation that we're going to be talking about mental health in conjunction with experiencers, but I would also like to take it in places where we can talk about how the government could be approached or how we could talk to the government about experiencers. But first of all, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us, Chrissy. Good to see you.
Can you tell me a little bit about uNHIdden and how the organization was formed?
Yes. So uNHIdden comes about with a very simple idea that it's better if we can have better conversations around UAPs. And the shame and stigma that many of us who try and talk about it to friends and family, that's not helpful. It's not helpful in progressing the wider conversation and the wider scientific endeavor here. It's not helpful to ourselves either. And so uNHIdden is a people-first mental health charity and organization led by doctors and psychologists. And it is moving in the direction of supporting people who've had exceptional experiences to have better conversations, to support anybody who's worried about the agenda and the dialogue for the scary things sometimes that are coming out in the news, and perhaps to prepare all of us for ontological shock should there actually be an announcement in that direction at some point.
Wonderful. There is a whole team. This is just not yourself Daniel's part of this, and you have a whole advisory board and a medical board. Can you break down who's involved with uNHIdden from both a medical perspective, but also advisory board perspective?
Yes. So we have on our medical advisory board, we have 2 doctors. We have a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, and we have a general practitioner. He's working at the primary level of the medical world, the first point of contact for patients. We have Dr. Daniel Stubbings, clinical psychologist. We have several other advisors. We have a clinical psychiatrist, and we have 2 other clinical psychologists who are working with us. We also have a number of ambassadors who share our values and are working with us, not themselves medical. So we have Admiral Tim Galladay, we have Jacques Vallée, Beatrice Villarreal, Alex Dietrich, and Sean Cahill. And we also have a wider network of people working with us that we call our all hands. So we've got about 20 or 25 people working with us, but at its heart, we're medically led. When you're dealing with mental health, it's not a time for amateurs. So it's the professionals, the doctors and the clinical psychologists. And I think we're very unusual, Chrissy. I don't think there are very many doctors and clinical psychologists working in the field of UAPs, and we have quite a number, and that makes us quite distinct.
For sure, there's not many. You know, we all know of Dr. John Mack, who did such wonderful work speaking about experiencers' experiences and also advocating for them in many ways. Daniel, I'd love to know how you ended up getting involved in this and what brought you down the UFO and along with the experiencer conversation.
Well, I suppose I spent many years working in secure forensic mental health services. And so I saw some of the most extreme kind of cases. And then I went to work in cancer and palliative care. And so I got to a point in my career where I felt like I'd seen quite a lot of what could be out there. And a friend sort of pointed out the Bob Lazar documentary on Netflix. And I was like, yeah, okay, let's just see what that's about. And I suppose at that point, I was a hardcore materialist, kind of existential thinker, atheist. But it kind of started me down the rabbit hole of exploring some of this information, because I thought within a day or so, I'm going to be pretty confident that there's nothing to this. But as I kind of went more and more down it, just reading more and more accounts, some of the amazing literature that's out there, the Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and David Grush and all that, it seemed like there was a genuine psychological and scientific mystery here that whether we prove it is all some prosaic ruse or there's something other here, both hypotheses are completely and utterly interesting, and we certainly need to look at it one way or the other. So that's basically how I ended up into all this. And I spend some days in the National Health Service in cancer and palliative care, and I spend some days at Cardiff Metropolitan University doing psychological research. And so there's no funding yet for UAP stuff. That sounds like there's a few things brewing for that. But for the most part, it's figuring out how I can get the UAP topic into master's thesis projects or undergraduate thesis projects, into student projects, to looking at some of the psychological aspects. And so there's this trying to find the sweet spot between research that's ethically doable and justifiable, that isn't too far out there, but hopefully pushes the narrative forward kind of in this area. So that's the short story.
That's wonderful. I think it's so important too, looking at this from all different perspectives, right? And getting clinical professionals to get involved to take this seriously. Have you looked at Dr. John Mack's work, and what did you think? And have you leaped off that work in regards to, maybe not to experiencers, but speaking about it?
So he was trained as a psychiatrist. So originally sort of trained in medicine, but he was of the sort of old school psychiatry that would also trained in psychotherapy as well. Hence, a lot of his cases were sort of psychotherapy and exploring some of the mental health sides of it, not just the medicine side. And so his accounts were quite interesting. It's a series of kind of case studies and some of his sort of views of treating or trying to treat experiences. And I suppose his work has been influential in the sense that it's a largely cautionary tale from my perspective, that it's what will happen if you start treating people with no assessment protocol no agreement on diagnosis, no agreement on formulation, and no agreed upon approach to treatment. So what you're doing is really literally off the cuff, which is great and is needed to push science forward. But I certainly don't want to repeat that mistake, and I certainly don't want my organizations to come after me, whether it's the British Psychological Society or the Healthcare Professional Council or the university. It's having to figure out how to move this forward in a professionally safe way, because his tale is one that he probably was trailblazing a little too far, and he got bit. And I don't want to really be in that position where I'm having to defend it. So some of the context of uNHIdden is kind of trying to build the structures from the UK out, like to where we can do that practice and help in a way that's defensible. And some of that's going to have to be an ethically sanctioned research that kind of goes little by little to make it kind of sort of possible for we can kind of open it up kind of wider. Now, that's largely if you're a registered health professional. So a position like a counselor, therapist, kind of, they're not legally protected terms over here. So anyone can call themselves a life coach. It's where when you've got a registered profession that you can then be pulled in front of your registration board, the stakes are a lot higher, and you won't be able to practice if you get kicked off that. So that's some of the wider. So Mac's work was influential, but I probably wouldn't say the most influential, simply because I wouldn't regard him as having done peer-reviewed psychological science that indicates experimentation and case study. There's no real methods that I can kind of replicate. It's sort of so it's influential, but not as a psychological science, almost as a starting point, really.
That's really great. That's a really great rundown, even from a clinical perspective too, of Dr. John Mac's work. John, I know that you mentioned that there's different pillars with uNHIdden. Can you talk a little bit about what those are and how they end up complementing and working with experiencers?
Yes. So our first pillar is looking out for the interests of people who are affected by things that they see today. Exceptional experience is the term we use, and that's a definition given in a 2010 paper by Professor Thomas Rebeyron, who's the founder of an organization in France called CERSE. The E and the E at the end give it away, expérience exceptionnelle. And it's a broad term. It's not just UAPs, it's all the things that are unusual and stimulating and out of the ordinary that give rise to a strong emotional reaction. And that includes a number of things which we would regard as part of the paranormal, like ghosts and poltergeists. I should be really clear here that uNHIdden is not making any statement about the validity and the reality of what people might see. But conversely, what we're saying is that we need to be patient-centric. The psychologists and the doctors need to be patient-centric and non-judgmental. And that's to say it shouldn't be ruled out that what the people are seeing has some element of reality. So our first pillar is around support for people who have exceptional experiences, and in Professor Rebeyron's words, to avoid the pathologization, it's not an easy word to say, which he means that people have the experience and then they go and seek medical help, and it's regarded as a mental illness. So what is an experience and something they want to share is given a diagnosis, which may or may not be an appropriate diagnosis. That's pillar number one, around people who are actually seeing objects with all the anxiety that goes along with that. Pillar number two is for all the people who are concerned about the narrative that's coming out, the uncontrolled narrative lacking consistency and coherence from the various branches of government. Can it be a good thing that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, live on Fox News or CNN or whatever, Representative Luna is asked about what's been going on in the meeting with the Inspector General, and she talks about interdimensionals. You can imagine the 6-year-old girl and boy sitting there, mummy, what's an interdimensional? We do not have a controlled, helpful, positive, trustworthy narrative, and in the absence of that, it produces unnecessary anxiety. During the COVID epidemic, the term doom scrolling was conceived. People worried about a topic, desperately looking for information. There's more than a touch of doom scrolling around the UAP phenomenon, and it's important to give that trusted narrative, and we hope uNHIdden is part of that. So we have on our website a page which we call the facts. Nothing but the facts. Everything there is peer-reviewed, it's referenced. These are things in the phrase, as you remember Hal Puthoff using at the Soul Symposium, Chrissy, you can take to the bank. And that's helpful because if you're trying to have a conversation about UAPs, you know that there's references there and you can fall back on that. So trying to produce a trusted narrative and reduce the anxiety that maybe all of us have from time to time from what's coming out in terms of the news. And then the third branch, the third pillar, if you like, is around looking ahead to what the world might be like in a post-disclosure world and starting to think about preparing and planning for ontological shock. What are the research topics? What are the things that can be done? What are the ways in which we can manage and mitigate? And I think there's a lot to be said for doctors and psychologists getting involved in that process for a variety of reasons, including the fact that doctors are the most trusted profession on the face of the planet. So there was a 2021 Ipsos Mori survey of the global professions, and doctors came out top in terms of trust. Why? Because first of all, they put patients first. And secondly, their medical ethics mean that they've got a duty of candor. That means they have to tell people the difficult news because there's a principle of patient autonomy, which means patients need to be informed so that they can take the decisions based on the information that they should have. I just put it forward that it would be rather wonderful if our governments worked with some of the same ethics that apply to our doctors and had a duty of candor to us and recognized the importance of our autonomy to take decisions based on what might actually be really going on out there. That would be quite a transformation.
That's awesome. And I agree. Doctors are so important. I think they're underrepresented within the UAP topic. They're not spoken about. I don't even think I've really come across, there's all different types of doctorates, but I don't think I've come across, as you guys were saying before, many psychologists or other types of doctors too. So I agree they're needed in many different ways as we, especially clinical psychologists, as we go through this type of unraveling of what the UFO topic is and what is happening and what does it mean to be human in conjunction with something that could be unidentified, that could be identified or real. Daniel, looking at ontological shock, what are you seeing right now in context of media that John was speaking about? And, I always joke around saying Debbie down the street is, it could change her whole life. And this was something I was a little bit concerned about when we released the David Grush piece. I brought this up to the guys and said, hey, we really have to look at this. This is a news piece for sure. And we have a lot of great sources backing this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it. But I was really concerned about Debbie down the street and how that would affect her life and how she sees herself. So where are you seeing that now in context of media, putting out all these different types of mixed messaging, along with then just the average person trying to see through all of this and what it means to them and the world around them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to that from two angles. I mean, first of all, it's thinking that the general scientific stance at the moment is there's nothing to see here. But when you look at things like the UAP Disclosure Act that was put forward last year, and we're pretty confident through our channels that there's going to be another version of that coming through, and some bits of that have been put in for whistleblower protection, that's some of the most serious legislation being put forward for something that doesn't exist. That seems a little too improbable. So I suppose just backing up a little bit, that John and I have not been kicking the tires of the UFOs to really kind of go on there and have a little wander around, but we're kind of looking at where this whole topic seems to be going and the seriousness of the allegations and the seriousness of people like David Grush coming forward with it. And so in the context of all that, your question of ontological shock and should you have released it and what's sort of going to be the impact, some of that with it, it's very important to have some kind of compassionate disclosure. I mean, just like um, death, for example, we're all going to die, but you don't say to a 3-year-old, "Mummy and Daddy is going to die," like. You don't need to say it that direct. There's other ways of kind of approaching those concepts that are developmentally appropriate for the child, the family, their religious beliefs, etc., etc. We almost have a controlled disclosure about, yes, children do get cancer, and you could die of a car accident every time you get in the car. But these other miserable life things that we come to terms with, we grade it in relation to somebody's development. I mean, maybe a 15-year-old with severe learning disabilities, you're not really going to hammer home some of the miseries of life that they may barely understand. So I guess we naturally moderate our explanations to people and contexts. So why would this topic be any different? If there's something to disclose, we need to do it in a responsible, compassionate manner. However, I think what you're kind of getting at is that is it going to be almost universally shocking and upsetting? Are people going to, the worst case scenario, people suicide, to do horrible things, become risky, really mentally unstable in some kind of way because of this? Do you cause undue distress by releasing something like the David Grush sort of interview? And I think, do we have any real pretense for that? Not necessarily. This is pretty new stuff. You could simply come at it from the moral aspect that, let's say your child's got cancer or your partner's been having an affair. Do you really want to wait till tomorrow to find out, or do you want to know today? Like, that some things are potentially so important that, irrespective of how upsetting or concerning they are, you, in my view, have a moral right to know. You might not have a right to know how to make a nuclear bomb, but I think you've got a right to know that they exist. And maybe we need to consider how we manage our international relationships. So, I mean, but the actual concern of, are you going to cause distress? We're starting to get to see the seeds of what's the scientific evidence that there's a problem. Now, it's a reasonable approach to take to have a controlled disclosure where you graded exposure. If you're afraid of spiders, graded exposure, little by little, you get over your fear of spiders. So it would make sense to do it in a controlled kind of sort of manner. But as far as I can tell, there isn't really any evidence for or a precedent where this has been done. But things have just changed kind of in the last sort of week or so. So basically, there's a really good researcher called Tim Lomas, surnamed Lomas, and in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, he's just released a paper, The UAP Disclosure as Ontological Shock, exploring the diversity among social media responses to a congressional UAP hearing. So what he did was he got basically 5,000 Twitter/X responses to the hearings. So it gives an indication of, if you were going to gauge the pulse of, ideally, we'd expose people to the full extent of knowledge from the black world. We'd take them onto a UAP, we'd have a chat with an alien, and we'd measure their impact, right? That's unethical. We can't do it, and we don't have access to it. So where are we at? So he's clearly kind of gone, well, the UAP, the congressional hearing last year, it happened. We can see an array of reactions. Were people freaking out of their minds? Were they not? Is essentially the kind of the question. And you could apply the same thing to your debrief article, but you could argue that the hearing got more exposure than the article. So the point remains the same. So his findings basically kind of so he did a grounded theory analysis. So basically, it's a qualitative approach where you kind of get all the responses and you sift through it, you read through it, and you build essentially themes of what kind of comes out of the data. And essentially, people's reactions, so to kind of answer your question as to how they respond, is that seems to be some responses are of concern, some are positive reactions, some are skepticism, some are indifference, and some are critical engagement, and various kind of combinations of that. And each of those kind of, groups have sort of subcategories. He gives examples of people's responses in those kinds of categories. However, one of the sort of caveats to all that is that if we talk about depression, we've got relatively agreed upon definitions for what is major depressive disorder, so professionals know roughly what they're talking about with one another. But if I say to you, what is ontological shock, you may have some definitions. Helen's great paper, white paper policy on the implications for the UK government have definitions in there. But Tim points out a really good point that in the scientific community more generally, that there's a general lack of scholarship and understanding into this central notion of what is ontological shock. There is no clarity or consensus in the literature on what exactly constitutes ontological shock, where is its conceptual borders, and where it ought to be placed. Is somebody who maybe read your debrief article and completely rebuffs it and scoffs it and goes, oh, what a lot of pish posh, and can't really process it, is that a sign of shock? The severe state of disbelief, is that shock? Or is it simply the emotional distress we're only calling ontological shock? And if you define ontological shock as that sense of deep kind of discombobulation and overwhelming sense of feeling of distress in relation to a shift in your reality or narrative, that's usually the kind of definition. What he found in his research was basically that there is a massive diversity of responses, which you'd expect, that the response to this stuff is as diverse as the people on the planet. And it's actually a minority of people that seem to have some kind of, oh my God, shock, I really can't handle this. I mean, I've sat through almost somewhat uncountable cases of severe sexual abuse and trauma work. I'm pretty unshockable. I've kind of heard almost every shocking thing there is, and I'm relatively resilient from a personality profile. So it's kind of like that. I don't think we have to worry about the majority. I think there's more of a minority of people that are going to struggle. And it also depends what and how is disclosed. So people's reactions to your debrief article or the UAP hearings, is one reaction. But what about allegedly some people who allegedly do autopsies on some kind of being, some biologic, as David Grush? Do they go through a level of ontological shock? And what services are in place for those people who can't even tell their children what job they do? So I think the concept of ontological shock probably has to be thought of as slightly more complicated, nuanced, and less agreed on as a term than we sort of initially sort of think. And we don't. My leaning from a moral perspective is that if true, this issue is so important that the psychological upset that it might cause is less important in my view. Just like if you've got cancer, do you really want your doctor to deliberate on whether or not he tells you? I mean, like, so at the end of the day, some things are upsetting, but I think governments and uNHIdden are trying to advocate that it's done in the most responsible way possible. Now, if you do have cancer and your doctor knows about it, the most unresponsible way is to not tell you and pretend there's nothing there.
True, it's a good point.
So really, uNHIdden is advocating in some ways that what can be safely disclosed be disclosed, and we respectfully consider the people hearing it, and it's done in a developmentally appropriate way for the people involved. Yeah. So yeah.
There's so many things. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. There's so many things to that. I do agree that you can be lost of empathy that might happen. We see that with doctors, right? We see doctors that have been through so many different cases or have seen so many different type of clients that they lose that attachment. There's like a fatigue of empathy, right? And it doesn't mean that they don't have empathy. There's just a fatigue of it because they've gone through so many different experiences and have seen maybe some horrible things. And I think that goes to all different people that deal people from fire to police that deal with this, government officials as well too. So I think there is a fatigue in that. But ontological shock to me is, I would agree, there is no term because it's on a spectrum. It's moving and shifting because everybody's ontological shock would be different. Now, I find really interesting since David Grush and throughout the past year or so, I've talked to all different types of people from all different belief systems when it comes to what they think is happening in from a UAP, what they think is happening around the UFO conversation. And I've noticed that people that will say lightly that believe, and it's not a belief system, but do truly think that there's something out there, after reading David Grush, their reactions have changed and they went through some kind of ontological shock. Now, I say that it's ontological shock because they're not sure if they're being told the truth. And I think that that's what's one of the most important things, is that they might feel that there's something happening, but their ontological shock is the belief that they can believe what David Grush has said or not, or what the government is saying to them. Isn't there a subtle difference in that?
Could be. I mean, in a follow-up sort of study I was doing in my own research that we're analyzing, is it was on a small cohort of sort of 10 people who had no exposure to this topic, no interest kind of whatsoever. And I exposed them to a whole series of material, from the key bits of the hearing to bits of the aerial school landing to everything I can kind of throw at them that's in the public sphere that has some degree of validity and verification, to just measure their reactions. Now, I was amazed that I got it through ethics, that I was allowed to expose people, because I really worried that people are going to sort of flip out. But people were like, I can't freaking pay my bills. Like, unless it lands in my back garden or produces me some money, I just don't care. Or that, you know, or they're like, well, okay, this is interesting, but there's so much to kind of get to grips with. I just don't have the time. Like, it's just not relevant to me. They're sort of like, well, if it is there for the 20 odd years I've been alive or whatever, because it's on average was slightly younger students or younger age people, and so like, well, I've not seen one so far, so what's the chances I'm going to see it the next 30 years? Probably just as maybe I will, maybe I won't. Like, why invest any of my emotional care and time into it? So, and I was really kind of quite taken back that a lot of people just openly just don't care. Now, does that mean, I mean, it's the same with some people don't care about cancer until it happens to them, or mental health issues. They're just like, I just don't care. It's not relevant. I mean, every time you jump in your car, you risk of dying, but you don't think about it most days because you wouldn't be able to function. So you're just like, I just drive the best I can, and I carry on and keep my fingers crossed and no one crashes into me. But it's certainly very relevant to think about your risk of how you drive and the idea. So it's very plausible that many people aren't that fussed. However, what I found in my other research around personality factors is that people who are high in conscientiousness and openness are more likely to at least report having seen a UAP than those that are high in neuroticism and agitation and schizotypy. So the people who are slightly more interested in the topic, more open to it, or even those that might be more shocked by it, might be high in conscientiousness, like, oh my God, if we're actually not alone, is a big revelation that if true, and then once you go down the rabbit hole and consider the full spectrum of what David's alleging, which is since the 1930s they've been collecting craft and biologics, it's kind of like the whole notion of 80 years of catastrophic censorship starts to creep in. And then you've got the problem of what else wasn't true, what else wasn't right in my life. Now, some of the people I did the qualitative interviews with, they're like, look, we're told COVID came from some animal. Now it's come from an actual lab leak. We're told it came from China, but actually it was funded by the Americans. Oh, wow. We're told the vaccines, one vaccine for COVID, you'll be fine. Now we've got multiple vaccines, and none of them seem to work. What I was also getting is that at this point in history, there's so many things like the Hunter Biden laptop. No, it's all Russian disinformation. Oh, actually, there was a laptop, etc., etc. That my impression is a lot of people are feeling very disillusioned on so many levels that if you brought out the UFO thing, for many, it's just like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's true. I think people are disillusioned and saddened in many ways and just have given up. They don't know what to believe because fake news, if you want to use Trump's word, is a real thing. Misinformation and disinformation is a real thing. And understanding how to weed through that, it can be very difficult, especially if you don't have the tools and you've never been taught to do it. And then it becomes part of your core belief system. It could become part of your core belief system.
Which is why we need science and leadership and things like uNHIdden to try and sort of explore the wheat from the chaff, try and help have a responsible narrative and take some leadership on the direction of this topic for the UK.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the consciousness comment that you made, that potentially people that are looking into the UFO phenomenon or you are interested in it might have a high conscious level, you're saying?
Conscientiousness.
Conscientious
So
level. But is that
I,
consistent to self-awareness as well, too, or could they be
I,
totally separate?
it's probably correlated. And I suppose when I talk about conscientiousness, I'm referring to the big five personality traits. So the neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness. Got another one.
Neuroticism.
Neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Openness was the other one I was. So yes, so openness is another sort of trait. So some people are high in, so they are the five personality traits that is pretty much cross-cultural. Like sort of doesn't matter who you are around the world, where you're from, the psychometric data indicates that the big five kind of is applicable. So some people are very high in openness traits, which is sort of their open to topics, and some are very low in openness. They're very closed down. Others are very high in conscientiousness. So they feel like it's important to do the right thing and to have attention to detail and to do something that's just. Other people are very, very low in conscientiousness and don't care about hurting people's feelings or upset things or how right things are. They're just very, very blasé. So, but the combination of high in conscientiousness isn't really quite the same as consciousness. Yeah.
Right. And so that's very interesting because I see that throughout many people I talk to that like the UFO topic. You know, they're looking for truth and justice. That's something that's so important to them. And I think then that's not really talked about a lot. You know, I find that those are the core staples that I say within talking about UFOs. People are like, why do you like it so much? And I said, because when I'm talking, not everybody, let's be mindful of this, but a lot of people carry those core belief systems. And that's why we enjoy spending time with each other, or we enjoy getting together in groups to discuss this, because it's something bigger than ourselves, but it's something that we are fighting for truth and justice in its own way. You know, people want to use the word disclosure or not, but we're looking for the truth and we want to know. And we want to know the biggest question, one of the biggest questions ever is, are we alone?
And I suppose that could be one of the biggest questions, but I guess we are seeking meaning and purpose as human beings because we're often trying to make sense of the world. And one way of explaining meaning and how we derive it is by having a degree of responsibility and adventure. And those two elements are, and Jordan Peterson is where I've ripped that from. It's sort of, he talks quite a lot about responsibility and adventure. And this topic has it in spades. It is the adventure of a lifetime to explore, and it's a pretty important, responsible thing to try and advocate the better understanding and the pursuit of truth in our position in the world and how we manage the custodians of this knowledge and this topic, really. So if responsibility and adventure are the heart of meaning, this is why it's become so meaning and pivotal to people to do, not just those that are experiencers, those like myself who haven't seen anything I can state is truly anomalous, of why it's so important. But then you'd talk to a group of beekeepers and they'd talk about the responsibility, importance, and adventure and sense of community that they have in the beekeeper world. like it's the coalition of that responsibility and adventure to explore something truthfully and to the best of your abilities, and then you'll have the adventure of your lifetime and find a sense of meaning and purpose, and hence what propels you forward.
Just wonderful. You know, we're all a big group of Goonies going on an adventure together. I think that's what I'll just call people now, or just our Goonies. That's what they are in the UFO topic. You're just one big Goonie. So what are the tools? And John, I might put this towards you, that uNHIdden have created to be able to connect with experiencers. And what tools do you have in your toolkit to communicate with them?
I think the first thing to say is, as a small group, the amount of effect that we can have is limited, save for where we can make an impact through the policy level. And so the biggest thing we've done is we produced a white paper. We published this in April. It's an analysis of the psychological background, the literature and the methods for doctors and psychologists for dealing with patients and others who've had exceptional experiences. It also covers the other themes as well. But at its heart is a recommendation that the UK government needs to acknowledge the legitimacy of exceptional experiences or UAPs. That's not to say that there's an explanation as to where they've come from, but we're in a bit of a bind in the UK because even though the 2021 Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the preliminary report made clear that UAPs are real and pose a safety of flight risk, the UK government is still on its message back to 2009 when it closed the UFO office at the Ministry of Defence that there is no military threat that the MOD has found in more than 50 years. I covered this in the debrief article I wrote in early November. Micah was very helpful in putting that together, entitled Why is the UK so far behind on UAP policy? And the reason why that's important in answer to your question is it's very difficult to move forward with medical practitioners at any sort of scale until the UK government and governments generally are going to acknowledge that the thing that people are wanting to talk to their doctors about has some legitimacy. If the default response is you imagined it, or you're a troublemaker, or alternatively slightly more on the psychological dimension, it's sleep paralysis, or it's false memory syndrome, or maybe it's psychosis or schizophrenia, less likely, then that's not something that much can be done about. And I wonder whether if one was to sit down with Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich or Commander David Fravor with all their radar sensors and the thermal imagery and go, okay, which one was it then when you were seeing the tic-tac in 2004? Sleep paralysis? False memory syndrome? Which one was it? No, because they have the panoply of sensors, etc., that's not a legitimate line of questioning. So why is it always illegitimate for experiences when they make contact with the medical profession for them to be taken at least credibly, if not actually full-on believed? So what we're doing is we're trying, first of all, to get the government to acknowledge that there's something legitimate around exceptional experiences. And then secondly, we're working with organisations like the French organisation I mentioned earlier, CERSE, Professor Thomas Robeyron's organisation, to try and bring in more of a non-judgmental protocol and approach for therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, so that the conversations start from the perspective of tell me what you want to tell me and I'm here to listen, rather than I have an overlay of views which judge whether what you're saying is real or not. We've moved a huge way in mental health in terms of a non-judgmental approach for many other things, like childhood sexual abuse, for example. We need to move a little bit further in the direction of at least giving experiences the opportunity to be listened to. And that way it's more patient-centric and the outcomes are likely to be better too.
I agree with you on that. I see that, and Daniel, this would be for you to comment on this. Victim shaming is a real thing, and people do it all the time. And they don't even realize that they're shaming a victim, or they don't believe victims. And I don't want to say an experiencer isn't a victim, but they've gone through some form of traumatic experience, right? And people don't believe them. Now, there's a mechanism of probably why that happens. And Daniel, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. But there are some parallels we see with that. Is it because that we don't want to step out of ourselves and care for others, and that we don't have that ability, or it's a learned ability over time? Or is it something totally else?
Is your question, why do people not believe them, or the resistance?
Yeah, the resistance. I think the victim shaming is a big part of it. You know, you see people that are victimized all the time and nobody believes them. and they end up believing other people. And then these people go on their entire lives feeling like they're not seen or understood. And I feel that there's a similarity between the victim shaming and people going through that trauma along with experiencers. Maybe I'm just trying to put two things together.
No, I think we all have a perception and view of life to navigate the world. We use stereotypes to quickly process information. If you had to analyze and understand everything on its merits there and then, you couldn't navigate the world just physically in your environment, let alone perceptually with people. So you use lots of heuristics, a way of filtering the world in information. And so that helps you somewhat sleep at night. Like sort of you go to bed at night and you assume your house is safe. Like you're under the premise that you've maybe locked the door and kind of there's someone else in the house. You're kind of under a reasonable assumptions, but they're all just assumptions. And so, but the thing is, people they will fight very hard to maintain a point of view because it helps them navigate the world. Whether that's your beliefs about how life is structured. I mean, it's sort of your beliefs about the spiritual realm or not. It's sort of like you develop an understanding of the world so you can easily navigate it. And somebody pokes and prods that. You've got some people who are maybe high in openness that go, yeah, sure, I'm open to that. And then you have others that'll just be like, I can't handle that. I need things to be in a particular kind of way. Now, we can often think we're far more open than we really are until we find something that starts to challenge it in some kind of way. So it's, on the one hand, it could be a degree of victim shaming, but that is a natural, the classic psychology experiment where you get a group of people randomly selected, you put A on one half of them, B on the other, get them to interact. They start fighting and kind of interacting and forming teams and competing. It's kind of like the Stanford experiments where you label a whole bunch of students, some are prisoners and some are prison guards. And then they had to shut down the experiments because the prison guards who were pretending in the experiment, that knew they were pretending, started hurting all the prisoners. So it's kind of like an us-them dynamic, an in-out group just affects our psychology, affects the way we perceive the world. I'm not saying that's a justification for disrespecting and shaming other people, but it's a proclivity and an inclination for human management. And on some levels, that's got a degree of evolutionary and social advantage. So one of the most stigmatized groups, and rightfully so, would be those who harm children. So if somebody's got an offense of harming children, they get a lot of stigma. We stigmatize them in society. We don't really want to be living next to someone that's flooded to the sex offender registry so we can monitor them. So that has an evolutionary advantage because we want to keep our children safe, and we think that's a danger to the well-being and care of children. So the mechanisms of judging the world aren't always well applied in every context. Just because it works for one particular scenario, or I go into this jungle, there's potentially a lion, so I should avoid that jungle, doesn't mean that some other jungles get mislabeled as having a lion in them when there might be paradise. So, but that all comes down to a degree of critical thinking and just having to practice respect for other people's views and don't physically hurt anyone and be as open as you kind of can. But respect that if some people who are going to vehemently oppose this topic, for example, maybe it's actually quite confronting to them. Like, I mean, when I come across patients who the scans show a big lump, they've got cancer, they're going to be dead within a year, but they're in clear denial that that's not the case, and they're going to live and they're going to be fine. When all the evidence points otherwise, I mean, it's not exactly very therapeutic to beat them over the head with their scans every day until they kind of get the notion that they're going to die. I mean, you've almost got to roll with the resistance, as we call it in the game, to sort of help explore and move them forward in a compassionate, caring manner to the goal of better understanding on what's the psychological barriers for them and how you break them down over time. And I think it'd be very much the same with this topic. I mean, we can probably think of certain debunkers that may need some hardcore therapy if this topic goes in the direction that it does, because they're so entrenched into worldview, their entire fame and fortune and dynamics are all set up on this is not real and I'm going to continue to prove it because I really can't psychologically handle the alternative. So it's important to navigate.
Daniel will run a special clinic for debunkers. We'll give a special hotline to speed dial you if they need that sort of a help.
Oh, for sure. And I do agree that there is the spectrum with, let's say, ontological shock, or people coming to some understanding of what might be happening. And this is a real phenomenon that is happening to humans. And I agree that there has to be this type of evaluation or system or protocol that has to be agreed upon with doctors, clinical psychologists, with everybody, along with government using it too within their own people that are experiencing stuff like this. But then we have this other spectrum that is a really hard shift that is still open-mindedness, and it comes from the spirituality community. You know, I'm a spiritual person. I have no problem saying that, and I'm not harping on the spiritual community. If anybody's going to send me hate mail. But there is this part where, you know, and maybe this is why experiencers go to the spirituality community right now, because there is another place for them. But there is a difference between being a life coach and then really needing clinical help. And I think that experiencers in all different degrees vary on that spectrum as well, because a life coach, they're great and they're wonderful and they can help you in many different ways. But when you're really dealing with something traumatic, you need specific help and proper help. And we see that the spirituality community can grab a lot of these experiencers and bring them in, and sometimes, unfortunately, exploit them. So where do we see now kind of hopefully removing experiencers from those types of groups and those types of people, and finding an evaluation or some format that we can go by that everybody could use collectively? How far are we away from that? And would it be something that it's even being worked on right now?
I think it depends on the level of the problem. And I think I'll let John speak a little bit about, I think doing the least intense intervention that impacts the most amount of people probably is the starting point, because that kind of applies to what John was talking about, conversations and encouraging conversations. John, do you want to just say about, we had like examples in the workplace of stuff of conversations. I think it is an intervention, but it's on a wide, low intense sort of scale.
Yes, I think the starting point is encouraging better conversations. And if we do move into a world where there is disclosure, there's going to be so many conversations that need to happen. We're going to have to do a lot of that ourselves. We can't rely on the state or the medical professionals. But we've been working within uNHIdden on some of the challenges about moving from conversations into the point at which people need proper professional care. And there are examples of people who are sometimes entire families who are seeing or having exceptional experiences, and they're seeking out leading people in the UK connected with the UAP topic or the paranormal topic, because they want to talk to someone and they can't get the help and support that they need from the professionals. And that puts those individuals, and in some cases our uNHIdden teammates, in a difficult position. On the one hand, they want to have a conversation, but they also know that there is a point at which proper medical help is needed. So we have policies and procedures for our conversations with members of the public. And we're particularly on the lookout for safeguarding issues where there are vulnerable adults or vulnerable children who may be involved. Now, uNHIdden is not able to consult, it's not able to refer. We're not an organisation that's set up in that way, but we are giving a lot of thought to what should happen at that point. When somebody does need help or care, where do they go? Do they go to the general practitioners, the first layer of the medical world in this country, hard pressed, very overworked? They get 10-minute slots with every person who comes to their surgery. How can you do this justice in 10 minutes? And then you think, well, there are community mental health teams who are more specialists, but they're also very, very stretched. Are they the right people to have these conversations? So there is this gap where we don't know where those people should be referred to. And that's where the dialogue with government needs to start to come about. And one of the things that's interesting in the last few days, really, Chrissy, here in the UK, is it's become clear that part of the UK government is working on a plan for disclosure. So if we go back to December, we have our things called select committees, and they're a little bit like your House hearings. And the select committee, which matches up to the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, had a hearing on the 13th of December last year. Not very well covered, but an MP called Stephen Metcalfe asked whether the UK government was preparing a plan for disclosure. And the answer was, sort of. The permanent secretary at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, a lady called Sarah Munby, she said that there was a team in the space division of the department that was working on a plan. And then a few days ago, Nick Pope, he put in a Freedom of Information Act request, and out came some sort of, it looked rather like a job description. And it said that there was a person, and it used the pronoun I, which suggests it's one person, was going to spend between 10 and 15% of his or her time over a 6-month period preparing some sort of a disclosure plan. So I did the maths, that's about 15 days. 15 days to come up with a plan for the most important announcement that governments will ever make. So something there doesn't quite stack up. And it could be that that disclosure plan is really for a very small part of the of disclosure as a whole. It could be, for example, disclosure of a biosignature from an exoplanet around a distant sun that they've discovered methane and carbon dioxide from the James Webb Space Telescope. Nevertheless, it's interesting. So uNHIdden has put in a Freedom of Information Act request to ask the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology which other departments within government are involved in developing that plan, what external agencies and organisations are being consulted, and whether any of those have a medical, psychological or psychiatric skill set. Because our hope is that plans for disclosure will have a high level of people-centric and people care about them. People-centric, people care about them. Because, as Daniel used the phrase earlier, we're strongly advocating for a compassionate disclosure. Carl Nell talks about a controlled disclosure as opposed to a catastrophic disclosure. We want a compassionate disclosure, and we're advocating, we look at Carl Nell's plan for those 4 lines of effort. I'll just say what they are. You were in the room in Stanford when he announced them. The first line of effort was around government. The second one was around natural sciences. The third one was around business and industry. And the fourth one was around humanities. And so there are a variety of professionals in each of those lines. There isn't one of those lines that has a doctor in it, or a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. There's nothing in that which is medical. There's nothing in that which is about people, mental health and well-being. So we're promoting, whether it's in the UK government's disclosure plan or the wonderful plan that Carl is putting forward, that there should be perhaps a 5th line of effort around medicine, driving a people-centric approach and driving mental health and well-being. And if disclosure is a process, what we're saying is we want active thought, research and effort put into getting as many of us as possible from this side to this side with our body and soul and mind and everything intact so we can keep calm and carry on. And I think that's worth putting some extra effort, extra thought in beyond the 4 lines of effort that are in the plan at the moment.
Right.
So really, to answer your question though about how we sort of helping sort of experiences and things, it's that encouraging better conversations, because the more people can talk about it, the more they can normalize it, and then they can feel safe to do so. I mean, most of us have probably had the experience where we've started talking about it and people say, oh, well, I've had a sighting, or have I seen this? And it's like, well, that's exactly what you kind of need. If you look at the change in stigma of, say, women's sexual abuse from the 60s to now, it's been campaigns about it, talking about it, and having it sort of become in the public eye, and then eventually successful court cases get kind of proven, and the whole narrative sort of changes. So I guess it's the conversations are part of that treatment process for society in a way. Then you've got trying to push the official narrative, which could have, John was sort of talking to how there's maybe some shifts starting to happen in the UK. But then I guess the next step beyond that is that we hope at some point to provide training to the services already out there, because most psychologists can probably do some of the work. You've got mental health nurses, you've got psychiatrists, you've got a whole GPs. It's sort of, if the healthcare professions were aware of the topic, just knew a bit more about it, what was real, what was not, kind of where to go with it, then all those structures in place can be utilized, because all it takes, I mean, is for an experiencer to be sort of believed and heard for a little longer, rather than somebody looking at their watch and kind of thinking, oh, you know, they've started talking about this UFO stuff, I think I'm going to have to refer on, they seem a bit crazy. And just to have some respect and time and take it at face value, just as if somebody said that they had a conversation with the Mother Mary and there's no other signs of mental health issues. They just want to talk about their religious experience, that people might be going, oh, okay, that's interesting and that's good and it's good for you. And they feel heard and they can move on with their life. That would be a big step forward. Just the wider health professions can just hear and receive and just accept it as they would a religious experience that gets sort of described. But then I suppose it's for those who may get exposed to it a bit more, to have a greater understanding and study of the topic. And then beyond that, it's the having safe structures for clinical assessment, formulation, and practice that can be worked on, so they don't end up in the position that John Mack was in. And then one thing in the early stages is building more of that academic network, so we can kind of all work together for academic researchers and clinicians sort of in the field to not necessarily double up so much and share ideas and things like that. And then I suppose there'll be another final tier of a gap where the services in the UK are structured that if you've got alcohol issues, you go to the alcohol service. You've got eating disorders, you go to the eating disorder service. And they're all funded differently. They're all funded in different locations. And so it's like there's going to be a point where an experiencer says, well, I had an abduction experience and then I developed alcoholism. But the alcoholism team say, well, that's actually trauma that you've kind of been through. So you need to go to the trauma team, not really the alcohol team. But the trauma team say, well, this is kind of an alcohol problem, kind of comorbid thing. We're not sure you're really for us. You should be for the alcohol team. And the alcohol team and the trauma team say, well, this all seems to be pretty paranormal because it seems to have followed you and yada, yada, yada. We don't know how to deal with any of this. So if we're not going to refer you to the psychosis team, then where do we kind of sort of send you? And so I think the UK will need a specialized, dedicated service for assessment and treatment and advice, even consultation to teams on how to manage a particular case, because there's also going to eventually be a legal aspect to this. So let's say this topic blows wide open, right? Then you're going to have somebody say, well, I crashed my car because a UFO was over it in the middle of the night. I shouldn't be liable. How on earth do we assess the legitimacy of that witness in a legal precedent? You know, and that's just making up a trivial-ish example. You're going to have prisoners kind of saying, well, I was controlled by a non-human entity and that's why I did this crime. And how are the courts going to assess that? By what psychological assessments that would stand up and yada, yada, yada. So it's the legal standard that's eventually going to be needed, some psychological assessment that would stand up in court, like you would in all the other areas of forensics. But it needs that level of stuff to then work out. Well, obviously, you're not going to need that for every case. But if the gold standard is worked towards, then the sort of lower level assessments that aren't needed in those legal sort of settings can all kind of sort of fit suit, really.
Right. And if you don't have evidence or proof, I think that's a really great comment that a lot of people aren't talking about is the legal perspective of this too. And looking at also, right, how the experiencers are dealt with within the system. I'm Canadian, so my system is a little bit different than the American system. But I think for most people, you're saying that no matter what you're dealing with if it's mental health or it's even with your physical health, you're kind of always pushed around all of the time. And you're talking to tons of different specialists. And mental health is very different than physical. We just can't point to it all the time. It has to be analyzed. It has to be reviewed over longer periods of time, from what I know. So you're right. We don't have that mechanism and we don't have those people or even a division to go to. So it's scary. And I feel bad for those people because this is why you have other psychologists that are outside in the system that are speaking to experiencers and giving them a place to be able to feel it's safe and they can self-express, and also documenting all that information that we do really, really need, if it's mental health or the experience is actually happening. And again, the legal ramifications, I think, I've honestly never thought about that. And that's scary because people will use and abuse that for sure.
Imagine corporations and businesses from their legal point of view. Let's say, do you have what's your supermarkets called over there? Woolworths, Coles? Like, what's your supermarket
Yeah, we have
called
tons.
over
We
there?
have
Walmart.
Blablas, which no one
Walmart.
likes right now.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So please,
What did you
Foodland,
call them? Foodland. All right. So let's
Foodland.
say
Yeah, well, food
somebody's
basics.
stocking,
Yeah.
yeah, somebody's stocking the food at Foodland, and they're doing it late at night, and an orb comes by them, and now they have cancer. So, did they get cancer linked to radiation exposure from an orb? And is that the company's responsibility to pay out? The company's going to say, "We don't believe in UFOs. We're not paying you for your cancer treatment because you say you got cancer from an orb that like we didn't catch on CCTV camera, and but you're saying you got through the workplace. Is that workplace compensation for like?" I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but it's kind of like the doors are going to open to all these floodgates that they've got to do anyway. If it goes in that direction, we can't not going to go down these routes. But they might seem silly and trivial, but it's kind of like we need to start thinking about them. If this is as real as Chuck Schumer is kind of advocating in the Disclosure Act, so we need to start planning for how we're going to manage it before the floodgates open. We get all these ridiculous kind of assessments or applications or genuine cases that get overlooked because they get cancer exposure in their line of duty, or something more serious might be a crash retrieval team, which has been alleged. So a crash retrieval team go out, they get cancer. Like, where do they go for their medical treatments if they can't tell anyone and they can't even prove that that's where it kind of came from?
Well, and we've heard in the past that I believe two people, or at least one I know of, won a
John
battle
Burroughs.
saying that they had some radiation or exposure from UAP, and they ended up winning money out of it. So we're seeing that people are doing it, and the court systems have taken it seriously at least once or twice. But you're right, there is no system. I can imagine insurance companies and other people thinking, "Oh gosh, like how do we even go about doing this?"
Mhm.
I'm curious, will the DSM change? And the DSM, for people that don't know, is the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Because a lot of people will say that experiencers have schizophrenia or they have another form of mental disorder. When this becomes even more real and is embedded within society, and maybe we have evidence or more proof of these things, and people do take this seriously, how will the DSM change, or do you feel the DSM will change?
Including the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases. So the DSM is more specific to mental health, but the ICD also kind of covers it as well, and there's quite a degree of overlap. I don't know the answer to that. I know there's some groups exploring and discussing some of those changes and what they will be. And on the one side, you could argue that a lot of it could fit within the diagnostic categories we have. So, like, some of it could be an adjustment disorder. Some of it could be post-traumatic stress disorder. You could sort of fit it sort of within those kind of categories. I mean, you could at a squeeze put things into like a psychological adjustment in relation to like they do it in relation to medical treatments and things where they've sort of been side effects. So there's a few boxes you can squeeze stuff in. And then there's just another category you can stick things not otherwise specified. But there's some that may not fit into any of those boxes. And I think we're going to have to look at the literature and do some proper literature reviews, and to do far more case analysis on the variants of where this could sort of going to go. Now, usually how it's managed in the DSM is there's a differential diagnosis section. There's like, if you've got this and this, go to this section. If you've got this and this, go to this section. And it kind of, or if you've got this and this is the bit that fits with this disorder, and this is the bit that fits with this disorder. So the differential diagnosis helps you work out, is it agoraphobia or panic disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder? And here's maybe where the overlap and some of the differences are. Now, where I am at my career at this point in time, I think diagnosis can be useful in some context. So it's like important to know maybe you've got a learning difficulty and here's the cutoff, or maybe there is enough symptoms of autism or some kind of cutoff. But I think more and more we're moving to the awareness that the DSM in particular exists to make conditions billable. They're not a reflection of truth. They're not a reflection of a true state of mental health taxonomy. They are an imposed system of construction. So there's others trying to build completely new diagnostic structures based on the data and the structures rather than the other way down. Like internet gaming disorder is a new disorder that exists in the DSM, but people haven't changed in 1,000 odd years. So like, it's not a new form of mental health. It just fits within other structures, but it's a new disorder in the DSM. So do we need a new category to explain stuff that fits in elsewhere? And what if somebody, like, say, gets cancer and then they get depressed, and the depression is a reaction to the cancer, but it's not really an adjustment disorder? Let's just change that with UAP. They see a big sighting, they see a big silver disc in the sky. It's really, really shocking. They go, oh my God, wow. And after about 3 months, because post-traumatic stress disorder is usually longer than 3 months. The first 3 months is normal adjustment to something really kind of shocking. But say it's more than 3 months, but they get depressed. Is that depression, should that be considered under a UAP kind of clinic research kind of viewpoint? Or is that kind of, are they depressed, or are they having a strong psychological reaction because their whole worldview is kind of sort of changed? And it's, I suppose in the UK, they're moving more to a formulation model rather than a diagnostic model. So the what is going on and why, rather than trying to fit which box it's in, because you'll find usually a bit of anxiety, a bit of depression, a bit of kind of personality variables that are kind of in there as well. And they all kind of are in the mix in creating that individual person. And from a cultural level to an individual level, and they all play into the factors of what emanates in somebody's kind of condition. And to actually stick it into a box or deliberate about a box is useful for clinicians and it's useful for research. But when you're from person to person, every kind of condition actually looks a little bit different and it's manifested for that person. So diagnosis might not quite be the right approach. I think human suffering is evident and real. The debates around how we categorize that will change over time, but we can still formulate how to proceed forward with that suffering and use the different tools in the toolbox, irrespective of what we call it. Because what does it really matter if we call it hysteria or depression? Like in the 1800s, you would call it hysteria. Now it might be emotion unstable personality disorder. You still got to do what you've got to do. Like if your driveway is dirty, it needs a sweep. Doesn't matter what you really label it. But I also get the other argument that if you don't give it a label, it's difficult to research, it's difficult to agree what it actually is. So diagnosis has its benefits, but we can still proceed with the topic without solving the issue of diagnosis.
Just add to that 2 points. One is what we think would be unhelpful would be a diagnosis and an entry in the DSM of exceptional experiences. That goes back to the other direction of travel here, which is the depathologization of exceptional experiences. And secondly, we want to draw a distinction between mental illness and mental health. Mental illness with the the entries in the DSM and the diagnoses that Dan has been talking about, mental health being something we all want to watch and improve and look out for in ourselves and for each other. And uNHIdden is much more about improving mental health and well-being than labeling any of this as a mental illness. And that's part of better conversations and about looking out for and looking after each other.
That's awesome. Thank you for saying that too. I think a lot of people just consume mental health, assume that mental health is the same thing as having a mental disorder as well. And the one thing too, you could have both and still have a UAP experience. Just because you might be dealing with it doesn't mean that something hasn't happened to you, right? It's not mutually exclusive in that way. So I think that people have to be mindful of that, because we do like to put people in boxes. We like to put terms in boxes because it's comfortable for us. And I think that maybe it's a start where we can point to things, but I agree, a more overall approach and a more holistic approach, I would say, of looking at this probably makes the most sense.
I was going to say, if it was a religious experience that somebody had, we wouldn't be looking to find a new diagnostic category to stick in the DSM because somebody's had a profound religious experience. They would just go, but that's part of an experience. And as John says, this could just be like that. It's an experience somebody's had, really.
Right, agree. And we can add and we can learn from that. Why push it away and say, oh, well, we know everything that we know when we've experienced everything? That's not true. There's so many people that are experiencing tons of different phenomena that's happening to them psychologically and also physically to them. So how do we know everything? We're learning, and science is learning and we're evolving every single day. So again, we have to be open-minded, especially within the mental health conversation. We have to accept people for the things that have happened to them. And it's scary, but we need to start, and we need to give compassion and empathy towards those people. We might not be able to say, oh, we've experienced that, but I can imagine somebody having some form of experience that they might just say, hey, if somebody walked into my house and decided to take me away, that's very much what it would, I think, would be the most close to being empathetic as you possibly could to some of these experiencers, outside of some of the most wonderful and horrible things that have happened to multiple different people.
Something else to consider is that there's unfortunately a lot of sex abuse that happens in childhood, but not all of them end up with mental health issues in relation to what they went through. Doesn't mean they should go through it. It still needs to be stopped, but it's kind of like, it's worth bearing in mind that just because you go through something shocking or extreme doesn't mean it's the road to mental illness and sort of problems. And sometimes what people find who have gone through horrific things, what they find actually traumatic and shocking is not actually the event. It's the social ostracism that happened around that. So by having the conversations, by opening it up, it's actually can destigmatize. They can talk about it and say, yep, that was awful, it shouldn't have happened, but they're less alone with it. And that not feeling alone means they can have support, they can open up, and that has a cascading positive effect. I mean, the cases of abuse that I've seen who have most struggled are where none of the family believed them about what happened. And it was almost that was more traumatic than the extreme details of what they went through. Yeah.
You're right. They want to be seen and heard, and we should be able to give people that space in any degree in anything that's happened. We need to be able to open our hearts to be able to say, hey, like, I believe you and I will make space for you. Because I think those things can potentially cause more issues down the road when you're not believed. And it's horrible. We humans love to push off other humans and not care. And there also are a great number of other humans that do, but it's very sad, that's for sure. So when we look at the government, there is a threat narrative, a massive threat narrative. It started in 2017 with the threat narrative. When do you think it's going to shift to a health-related one and a concern when it comes to mental health and physical health for both experiencers, but people also dealing with the phenomenon? We look at pilots, we look at tons of different people within government. When do you think that's going to shift and be more important than threat, or will it ever?
One of the the developments that's very relevant to the UK, again, in the last few days, since it's all moving so quickly, is the publication by the Sol Foundation of the white paper produced by Helen Core, who's a former Bank of England economist, entitled Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, Policy Implications for the Government of the United Kingdom. And the reason I bring this up in the context of your question about the health narrative, Chrissy, is on page 40 of this document, there is a paragraph, a very important paragraph on mental health. And it talks about how the government, health agencies, the professional bodies and charities should work together on the mental health aspects and issues to do with ontological shock, which is what the paper is all about. We hope, and this is a very well written, very well sourced paper, we hope this will be in the incoming ministers' red boxes when our general election happens on the 4th of July. That's what white papers are for. They're statements of government policy. That's what their origin of the term is. I wrote several white papers when I was a Cabinet Office civil servant back in the day. So it's nice to think this very well-sourced, authoritative and well-written paper will be in the hands not only of the science ministers, the defence ministers, the Cabinet Office ministers, but maybe the incoming Secretary of State for Health as well. And then the various organisations can work together. And indeed, uNHIdden is convening a meeting of charities connected with mental health, professional bodies and others to do with mental health delivery, see whether we can get the collaboration recommended in that paragraph to start happening. And so we can start to prepare the way with a new government for more of a health narrative alongside all the other aspects of UAP disclosure.
It would be wonderful to see the UK lead that. I know there's not as much conversation within Canada, none at all. We're doing Sky Project Canada, which is our Canadian government is doing a so-called analysis, which might be a nothing burger. And we also then have Arrow, who's putting very uninformative reports out, let's say, all the time. Sometimes there's some nuggets in there that are great, but let's just be honest, the last report wasn't that wonderful. So I hope that if the UK steps forward and looks at this from that health perspective, that's something they could be a lead on. We have to work together globally, and our countries have to find some answers together. So it'd be wonderful to see that.
Yeah.
Yep.
To add to that point, that it's a second what John was saying, but your question about the threat narrative and when it will end, my take on that is that let's say there's a whole bunch of people campaigning about flat Earth. Right? Now, if they'd gone to the Congress and said, we really want our own support group for those who are being denied that we've got a flat Earth, Congress would ignore it and they'd laugh it out. So the reason I'm bringing that up is I think that the reason they brought the threat narrative is because it was the most useful one to push it forward in Congress. If they brought anything else forward, whether mental health needs, people are not being believed, it would be a non-starter. It had to be, there is a threat to flight safety. These things are in our airspace, they're monitoring our nuclear stuff. So I think that is a vehicle for opening up the topic. I think military organizations are always going to be worried about threat. That is their job. I hope they keep us safe. So it can expand beyond the threat narrative as Congress in the US kind of gets a hold of it, and hopefully we get success in the UK and we kind of move forward with it as well. So I see the threat narrative as not as a bad thing, but as a vehicle for a stepping stone for the whole topic.
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree with you too. I think that threat narrative is misunderstood. Most people are like, we're not saying that these things are a threat. Then, well, unless you're talking to David Grush or to others in what you believe and what narrative you believe or follow, that yes, that is a threat narrative for sure. And it's scary because people are dying and when they're having contact, or there's other people within government that are trying to silence them. So for sure, there is a threat there. But I think initially when Lou Elizondo and Christopher Mellon were looking to put this forward, you're right, they knew this was the only thing that we could possibly do to get people to pay attention, because it's sad. They won't listen to mental health. They won't listen to other elements that are just as important. but they will listen to threat. But it did get through. And I do feel that it might be misunderstood from a general populist perspective. But thank you so much, John and Daniel. Thank you for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. And as I say to all of my guests, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.